Thanks for tuning in to Keep It Legal, the show where we break down concepts, litigation, and current events with our legal experts. I'm your host, Mark Anik. Joining us today is Andrea Perez, partner with Carrington, Coleman in Dallas. Andrea is an attorney here, and when I look at your bio, one of the things that I notice is there's litigation, there are all sorts of things. You're one of the few lawyers whose bios I can look at that says art. So I want to talk about that a little bit before we get into some of the cases in front of us. How did you end up with art as a part of your legal practice?
I always explain it as, it was just something that I just had to do. Literally the last semester of law school, you're a lost puppy in law school. Like, what are you going to do? What do you want to do? Took a course in arts and antiquities law. And I was like, I found it. I finally figured out where I belong in law school. And after that, I just took every course I could imagine, read every book, went to every conference, started volunteering for legal organizations that provide pro bono services to artists and arts nonprofits. And just was very intentional about trying to learn as much as I could and practicing this area. And then it's just grown over the years. Dallas here, I'd like to say I'm probably the attorney that's practicing art law the most out of everyone. And I love that.
How much of your practice is art and how much of it is commercial litigation?
Yeah, so I actually stay away from litigation a bit unless it's involved, art is somehow involved in that. I'm primarily transactional attorney and do some mergers and acquisitions, some trademark work too. But in the art side, it's almost all of my practice these days. So some days, about 25% is related to sort of general corporate work and M&As. The other part is just all art.
That's really fascinating. So let's start with the one most recently in our own backyard in Dallas. This happened last month, and I'm talking about the break-in and for a period of time, occupation of part of the DMA. Do you want to give us the rundown on what happened there?
Yeah, unbelievably tragic and sad. My heart goes out to everyone at the DMA, everyone working at the DMA. I have friends there. The people that work at the DMA work so hard. And so for them to have to deal with this, it's heartbreaking. When the news broke, I instantly my heart sank. Not only as a lover of the arts, someone who supports the arts, someone who supports museums, but also, just knowing what they had gone through too. I mean, and it's shocking, you see these things in movies, right? Or you see these things, typically you see more heists and more break-ins kind of in Europe, happens a lot. But, you don't really expect that to happen, in your backyard, just a few blocks from where I'm working, where we're sitting right now. And it's just so shocking, kind of the events too, having obviously this very, very young individual, you don't do things like that unless there's some mental health issue there. What it revealed was that something was also wrong with the security at the DMA too. This wasn't someone I think, had an intention of going in and stealing anything. This seems like a complete fit of rage and someone who had lost control. And so for all these things to happen to me, I think there's a culmination of some missteps along the way in a lot of different areas. One thing I'm really impressed with, though, is that the DMA has stepped up and said, we are having this looked at. We are going to be fixing things. There has to be a change after this, and sort of revealed that there maybe are some security issues that they weren't aware of. A whole series of events, it sort of started from what I've read. This individual was able to grab a metal chair and throw it through the front entrance, right? That's, and
sounds rather incredible that you can do that at a museum.
Right. To me, my first thoughts were, I don't know the kind of glass they have in the front entrance. I don't know, I would assume that it's a thicker glass or bulletproof or something, and then, there's a pause. From what I heard, there was a pause for about 6 minutes. So he kind of sat there and thought about what he was going to do before he entered in. Right. And then at that point, it just became like a rampage of just destruction. Not only was priceless artifacts destroyed, history destroyed, but there was also, sort of the equipment and computers and other things too. Seems like he was just wanting to destroy everything he could see. And then it's interesting, what's kind of unclear is when does the security get involved? We know that Dallas police showed up, approximately 30 minutes after, which is also like you think in your mind, well, it's the museum, it's a cultural institution here. It's owned by the city. It should be, like immediate. I'm sure there's a lot of investigating going on about the alarm systems and what happened. It's awful that anything happened, anything destroyed, but I'm glad that it wasn't. The Cartier exhibit is there right now. There's so many other things in museums that are just in that museum that are incredibly valuable. So, the damage was, they were able to control it before things got worse. I know they're very serious about taking steps to remedy it.
What goes through your mind when in reading the coverage, and obviously you know this better than I do, but we were talking about pieces that were destroyed that were thousands of years old. What's your reaction when you think about it as someone who works in the arts?
Oh, like tearing up, those things are just so important, and to understand previous cultures and where we came from. And so I assume they're going to try to put them back together. You repair things, there is a conservation to items in a museum, right? You conserve a painting, work has to be done on artifacts and objects, but it's not going to be the same. And so it's just, I wish there's just someone that could have intervened and just told, I see this person as a kid, he was 21, that's so young, right? This is not a good idea. This is something that, some kind of intervention on a mental health level with him. So it's not like, he probably didn't even know what he was breaking or the value it had.
You mentioned, and I want to be careful that we don't point fingers, and I don't think you want to do that either, and I appreciate that. But you mentioned that it took some time for the security guard internal person to get there.
Yeah.
And then it took longer for the police department to get there. Does that surprise / shock you, given the value of items that exist in that building?
It does, but I don't know why that happened. I don't know if perhaps, the security guards at DMA thought they had it under control and didn't need additional support. I don't know. This particular instance made me think of something that happened in Germany recently with the Dresden Castle and the Green Vault. So there was a big heist in Dresden in its jewelry, and they stole approximately like 127 million, maybe more worth of jewelry. And they have it on camera, and you can look up on YouTube and see the break-in. And I believe they were in and out in like 2 minutes or something. They got so much, So it's like, whether, a lot can happen in a very, very short period of time, or, a little can happen in a long period of time, or a lot more can happen in a long period of time. But, in that particular instance, they have I believe there's 6 of them. Robbers are in trial right now. Germany actually won't release the names of who they are, which is interesting for privacy reasons. In that situation, they have not recovered the jewelry yet. They don't know where it is. These crimes, you kind of always have to be prepared for the absolute worst, because what this also reveals is that the institution is vulnerable, and that's scary. There was another case, I think this was in the 50s, involving the Tate in London, and it was a political statement where these gentlemen, they were Irish and they were upset. I guess a collection of art that was supposed to belong to Ireland was moved to the UK, and there was a lot of obviously a lot of conflict with the IRA and what was going on, and as a political stunt, these 2 guys walked into the Tate and just pulled the painting off the wall and walked out and got in a cab and drove off, So it's like, the Tate was, obviously very embarrassed. Like, the vulnerability of the institution is like, wow, someone just walked in and walked out.
You would assume that were you or I to do that, we'd be stopped before we could get out the door of that gallery, never mind the front door of the museum.
Yeah, right? Yeah, like it was, And there's a photograph, which I hope I have these facts right. I haven't looked at this case in a while, but there's a photograph in real time of the person stealing the painting and walking down the steps out, getting into the cab, and it happened to be like a journalist that just happened to be around and snapped the photo, and the painting was returned. It was never, it was more about political awareness. It was never to be destroyed or stolen or, sold or anything like that. It was more of just sort of drawing attention to what their cause was.
It feels like, and you know better than I do, so correct me if you think, but it feels like every time one of these happens, we see it as what it should be, a wake-up call for this institution and others to say, we need to shore up our security. And yet, there's still another incident later on. Is that a fundamental issue that the art community needs to deal with?
It is. And, and I've sort of rattled my brain of why this happens. Criminals, there are very brilliant criminals out there, right? I think there's such, you can have all the security in the world and there could be, potential breaches, right? But to me, I feel like this is a funding issue here. I feel like our museums are embarrassingly underfunded federally and by the states. They don't, most institutions here in the U.S. are nonprofits, private, that are funded from individuals, right? So to me, I'm wondering too, if this is a situation of what happened here is perhaps there's a lack of funding, right? There's a lack. It's very everyone is very open right now that there's a lack of funding for salaries in museums right now, and you have these extremely well-educated individuals working there that are not, being able to be paid what their value is. So, that was also a situation too. The funding was an issue too with the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston and their heist, which is, say, probably one of the most famous, over $500 million worth of paintings stolen. They still have no idea where they're at. When
you mentioned that this gentleman was in the DMA for that long a period of time at the Gardner Museum, they were in there for even longer that night, right?
Yeah, exactly. Very strategic, knew what they were looking for. There's also, you can see videos where they sort of recreate where the robbers went and how long they were in this room, and then when this...
I've seen this.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, so, and I don't know if they're ever going to recover those. That was in 1990. At least in what I've read and studied, is that the lack of funding and the lack of an upgraded security system was a big reason why that happened.
Let's move on to another one, because we have plenty to talk about. I want to talk about what happened at the Louvre with the Mona Lisa. Now, you mentioned the one at the Tate, and this sounds like a close cousin.
Yeah.
They were, of course, not able to take the Mona Lisa off the wall, but just the notion that somebody could walk up to it and describe what happened here in front of a whole crowd of people.
Yeah, well, so this was also in the reaction too of after what happened to this criminal versus the criminal that we're dealing with at the DMA too is interesting as well. So so this individual, planned this ahead before, came into the exhibition and I've seen the Mona Lisa. She's very, very far away from the crowd. There's hundreds of people. You essentially have to lift up your phone really high to try to look at it, to see it and then bring it down. It's very heavily guarded. They have it behind glass, that I assume is like bulletproof and can withstand, warfare, right? But he purposefully chose to be in a wheelchair, pretend to be in a wheelchair, because people with disabilities in wheelchair are allowed to get closer. So he chose that and then dressed up as an elderly woman, even though, I saw pictures of what he was wearing and it's not a very good costume. It looks very strange.
Editorial comment on our part, but
yeah, right. And so, he grabs a piece of cake and says several things about climate change and his political stance about how we're not doing enough about climate change, and then smears the cake over the protective glass, and he's immediately apprehended, right? And, because there's so many people with their phones out capturing the Mona Lisa, they were able to get all kinds of angles on him, he was easily, the evidence is all there.
Yeah, I was watching these. The replays there are many of them.
Yeah, right. I guess that's one of the good things of being in an age where we have cameras on our phones. You can capture, everything in real time. And so, so he was making a political statement. He's instantly taken to a mental institution and for psychiatric, care. So I don't know much details on why that decision was made. I do appreciate that decision. To try to figure out, get this person help, understand, there's a crime, but most people don't commit crimes unless there is some issue of mental health, right? Which was very different to the reaction here in Texas, in Dallas, which was arrest him and he's, still in jail. I don't think he's made bail yet. Whether or not he's getting a psych eval or any kind of psychological help right now, I can assume things. My very first job out of law school was a public defender.
I saw that in your bio. That's fascinating for someone who does what you do now.
Yeah. So
did you like working in the PD's office?
I did. It is a very challenging job, very rewarding, and you help a lot of people. But my biggest takeaway was everyone in that jail has mental health issues. That's not being treated. And if you can get that help, the repeat offenses
go down,
tend to go away. Yeah.
One of the things that the Mona Lisa incident reminds me of, and again, you know this better than I do, is that it feels like the art community is constantly up against this very fine line, right? Where we want to be able to show men's great and women's great creations to the world. And we want all of us to be able to go to the museum and enjoy them, but we have to protect them at the same time. And it feels as if they're constantly up against, trying to find that right balance.
Yeah. It's like, I feel a lot of people take for granted what's in a museum. And I feel our governments take for granted too. Like these are very, very precious things that museums provide a place of therapy. They provide a place of education. They provide a place of inspiration. They change people's lives. Me going to museum changed my life and wanting to be an art lawyer. There has to be the right amount of funding to protect these cultural institutions that we love so much. And when it comes to that, when it actually starts, writing the check, I feel like that's still lacking,
It's funny that you mentioned that with regard to public funding of museums and the lack of it here in the United States. My daughter's a college student who happens to be studying in Europe right now. And she's stunned by the fact that there are all of these museums in London that are free.
There's, museums heavily rely on their donors. There's a reason why they have these big fundraisers and things for the museum. And, it's just people have, the people in Congress a lot of them have different values on that and the appreciation of that. But when one of them is broken into and things are lost, everyone is so upset.
I want to go back to something that I guess is more applicable in the DMA situation. Because you mentioned the Cartier exhibit that's there. In the worst part, and I want to get into your background more, which is law. You mentioned Cartier exhibits there. Had that gentleman stolen a piece or damaged a piece, would the DMA have liability?
I don't know the contracts between the DMA and Cartier for that exhibition. I'm assuming there's some indemnification in there that would make sense. I mean, that's pretty typical when works are loaned to another institution. There's an agreement about insurance requirements and who's responsible and indemnification. So, I would assume yes. I do know that Cartier, from my understanding, Cartier did have their additional security there themselves for their specific exhibition and security requirements for their exhibition. So lawyers would be involved if that happened. There would be a lawsuit.
Your telephone might ring.
My telephone might ring. So, yeah.
All right. Do you want to move on to the Chagall? So this is a story about Stephanie Clegg, who has what she believes is a Chagall that she bought at a Sotheby's auction in the 1990s. And now the suggestion has been made that perhaps she should sell it. She goes back to Sotheby's to have it properly appraised or elsewhere. Does she send it elsewhere?
No, she goes back to where she got it from.
Okay, even better. She goes back to where she got it from, and go ahead.
So this actually happens frequently. Yeah, so she buys the piece. It comes with the authentication, the experts, Sotheby's has done their homework on this. And they all the auction houses do, by the way, sort of a an insider tip is, every lot that comes in to the major auction houses, they have to do their research and their provenance, and they do. They have, specialists in all different realms of arts and antiquities that research these things. And so they conducted their due diligence, and the provenance looked good, and sold it to her. And then, she hears that there's sort of a market for this piece, puts it up again for the auction several years later. And as again, part of the due diligence and and making sure the provenance and the authenticity is still accurate, they send it to Perez or for the experts in Chagall, right? And expecting no issues because it's already cleared before as being, authentic. And then they get a report saying, no, it's not. So Sotheby's has a right to not sell it. Obviously, if it's not authentic, they're not going to do that. What are her legal rights? I mean, the person you bought it from saying it's legit is now saying it's not. And this happens with quite frequency. It's really hard to get something authenticated. There's sort of certain, successful artists have, authentic, they may have like a board appointed for authenticating their work, or if the artist is alive themselves, right? That's the best source. It's really hard. Like Keith Haring, they won't, authenticate those works. Or Andy Warhol, we can't authenticate those works anymore. Trying to find an expert to authenticate a painting is becoming very, very difficult. They don't want to be sued, right? And so things like this happen. And from my understanding is she's sort of wanting all her money back, which,
one would not blame her.
One would not blame her for that at all. Typically in auction, when you sell a work through auction, in that contract, when you purchase, through an auction, there's going to be some limitations on how long the auction company themselves are going to be liable, because they're not going to promise forever and ever and ever that it's authentic and there's no provenance issues.
Which is basically what Sotheby's is saying now in response, right? That period of time has expired.
Yes.
Now this is a legal case, right? She has lawyers. Sotheby's has lawyers. As someone who works in this area, do you have any sense as to how you would handicap this?
I don't know all the particulars. Yeah, and I haven't seen the contract she signed. A lot of these issues that arise, in my experience, are typically settled out of court. Let's work out something that's much better publicity for the auctions. It also, you would want, if this person is a collector and they've been a collector with your auction house for a while, you would want them to continue to be a collector with you. So I imagine the parties are probably negotiating heavily right now on trying to reach a settlement. I would think.
You said this happens more frequently than you would think. As someone who's not steeped in this like you, I find that surprising.
Yeah, well, we learn more, as time, we now have better ways to analyze a painting with science, right, than we had before. New information may come out in other manuscripts and things about this artist we may learn. I've heard estimates that about 50% of what is out in the art market is fake. There's a lot out there. I've personally dealt with cases involving fakes. It's common. What is something at some period of time, you think you have all the facts and you have all the backstory and information, but then some new piece of evidence could come out that maybe this type of paint didn't exist at that time period that you didn't know before, right? Just very, very little minor things that could make a work that you thought for many, many years was real, not. One with Christie's, so we'll pick on Christie's now, is interesting, involving a Fabergé egg, and this was back in the 80s. So there was a collector. He was Iranian. His name is Iskander Aryeh, and his thing was Fabergé eggs. He wants to collect and have the largest collection of Fabergé eggs. Christie's had put up a Fabergé egg in 1977 that they had deemed to be an imperial Fabergé egg. So the imperial Fabergé eggs are the very, very special ones, and there's supposedly approximately 50 to 60 of those. That's it. But they made other Fabergé eggs that were obviously very valuable, but the imperial ones were given to the czars and the very special. So he thought this was an imperial Fabergé egg. And so he purchases it and flies into Switzerland to take a look at it and sees it before paying and says, this isn't real. This is an imperial egg. I don't believe it. I don't believe it's real. There's some flaws and it's not of the quality of an imperial egg, things like that. And he's not willing to pay. So Christie's actually sues him for not paying, and they're in this disagreement over it. And then Christie's presents a report from an expert in Fabergé eggs. And he gives this report that without a doubt, this is, here it is. I confirm without hesitation that this is undoubtedly an authentic work by Fabergé. And he's the expert on Fabergé eggs. And so getting that piece of evidence, he says, okay, I'll buy the egg and I'll pay $200,000 for your attorney's fees for having to go through this issue. Then he decides several years later, the market for imperial eggs had gone up significantly. I think he paid about like $250,000 for it at the time. Now they're 7 figures in value. So he wants to sell the work. He goes back to Christie's. And now they say, no, I'm sorry. The same expert retracts and says, this is not a real Fabergé egg. This is not an imperial Fabergé egg, I should say. They settled out of court. It's just even experts themselves can retract their previous opinions on things. So it happens.
Do you have any advice that you give? I'm assuming that perhaps if I had that kind of ability and I were going to acquire one of these, I might come to somebody such as you in advance, right? And say, Andrea, what do I need to do? How do we draw this up? What sort of advice would you give to someone who might be purchasing?
So it's going to be different based on whether we've got a contemporary work, the artist is alive, versus one where the artist is not. Because if we've got a living artist, we've got someone we can go to right there. Right? Galleries keep records of everything. Artists keep records. We have electronic records now that are much easier to keep track of the provenance and the sales, right? Less risk. If we're looking, obviously the older the work, I think the more risk. And not just with authenticity, but even repatriation too, all of the Nazi stolen art, right? If this was a work that was sold during World War II in Europe, that's red flags. There's huge red flags, right, on whether that was properly acquired or stolen. And then at that point, if that particular artist does have sort of an authentication board or people that are in charge of authenticating, that's the best place to go. But with like the Chagall, it was authenticated by that board and then said, no, we've changed our mind. I don't think you can do anything to prepare for that. If not, then you're going to be relying on experts. I mean, there's appraisers that specialize in just very particular types of art and certain artists and sort of become the experts in that. As far as like what you could do to protect yourself, collectors should have insurance. There's fine art policies, things like that. You should look carefully at the agreements with who you're purchasing the work from and have an indemnification clause in there that says if it's not authentic, you'll get your money back.
Okay, last one, where we try to answer the age-old question, can you tape a banana to a wall and end up being subject to a copyright action because of that?
Yeah.
What's the answer?
Oh, gosh, this work is, I remember reading about it and I was like, the papers I'm going to have to write about this banana and the conversations I'm going to have about this banana. And also teaching at SMU an art law course, we're definitely going to talk about the banana. So it's so fascinating. So, the work by Maurizio Catalan is interesting because it's called Comedian. And if you see his comments on it, he says it's not meant to be a joke. So that was my first interesting. Art Basel, I believe it's 2019. You see, sort of the showstopper. The one that broke the internet was a real banana duct taped to the wall. I think the sales price was about $120,000. I heard a rumor. I read this somewhere that if you purchased that work, the bananas would be continually replaced. But I don't know if that, I'm not sure. And I believe there's some artist proofs that were sold too of it. Lo and behold, this very unknown artist named Joe Mortford sees that and says, that's mine. You're ripping it off. I got to hand it to him. He has a copyright registered.
Going back to 2000.
I couldn't believe it. When I saw that, because artists are not the best at registering the copyrights in the United States. It's costly, it's complicated. And so so he did it. I mean, he has a valid copyright for purposes of copyright law. It's been registered before the infringement happens, so he's entitled to statutory damages and attorney's fees. But he's seeking essentially the profits from the sales. And I think it's roughly about $390,000. This artist is also pro se, which is going to affect the case in a significant manner, because when you have someone pro se, you have to help them a bit, right? You want to make sure they get their day in court. And this is a complicated federal copyright case, and this is serious. And federal rules of civil procedure are very complicated. And I was reading the motion to dismiss recently, and the court even is trying to help him and giving him guidelines. Like there's a footnote saying, by the way, you submitted a brief that was 69 pages and it can only be 20 pages under the federal rules of civil procedure. Like pro se parties are some of the most difficult lawsuits to handle.
Given that's an artist representing himself, does that lessen the odds of an out-of-court settlement?
I don't think so. No, I mean, maybe. I mean, to bring a case of this caliber and pro se, he's obviously very angry and very adamant on getting payment for this. So, the lawsuit was filed, and, the attorneys for Catalana immediately filed a motion to dismiss as soon as possible to, say, he doesn't have any legal claims, blah, blah, blah. And one of their arguments is essentially saying this is not something that is subject to a copyright. Saying it's a banana, it's a nature object, it deteriorates, and it's duct tape, which is a useful object. So essentially, part of the crux of their argument is saying you can't claim copyright infringement because this is not even something that would qualify as an original work of art for copyright protection, which I would really have loved to have been in that room when that discussion happened with the artist. They had something really interesting in their motion to dismiss. They cite a case, Kelly versus Chicago Park District, that held a copyright in a flower garden was invalid because it failed the fixation requirement, since flowers are living things existing in nature that morph over time. So for a copyright to exist, the work of art, and for you to get the protection of the copyright, you have to fix it in something tangible or something, others can see.
So you could make a painting of a banana.
Yeah, exactly. The attorneys for Catalana argue that because the banana deteriorates, it's like the flowers, and they say, like the vegetation in the Kelly case, defendant's real banana is a living thing that changes and ripens and ultimately rots and degrades. Accordingly, it cannot be covered by copyright. It's really fascinating, but the standard to overcome a motion to dismiss and survive a motion to dismiss is very, very, very low. And so, the fact that this case is continuing on, I am not surprised about that. That makes sense.
Well, yeah. I understand why you're fascinated with this as a practice area of law. Just talking about these cases has been a blast. I appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you again for joining us today. That was Andrea Perez, partner at Carrington Coleman. You can visit ccsb.com for more information about Andrea and her firm. To all of our listeners, thanks very much for tuning in. Remember, you can write in questions for our next guest on any of our social media channels. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram for more information about each episode. Make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and tune in next time to Keep It Legal. I'm your host, Mark Anik. See you then.